skirt by this point that you made just a few moments ago about the justification for categorizing sections, subsets of the population as inherently, intrinsically, and immutably deficient is to no longer have to do social spending on them. So if you are a person who, perhaps because of your ideological priors, does not believe in social spending, does not believe in a social safety net, does not believe in upward mobility because you're at the top, and why would you want that competition? Because you want a depressed labor class to exploit. For all of these reasons, of course, there is an obvious political relationship
Exactly.
between this so-called science, the pseudoscience, and your personal economic project. And I don't want that to go unmissed as we consider why these arguments are being redeployed, frankly, very effectively today. I want to get into that in more detail, but I don't also want to sidestep. We've mentioned sterilization a few times. As a history of science major who took history of medicine classes, I am very familiar with this history. But I do think that sometimes the average person doesn't actually understand how bad this stuff was, the scale of it. Tens of thousands of people in America sterilized. What was it? 1/3 of the population of Puerto Rico sterilized?
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yes, exactly. And that sterilization laws in some states, I mean, it took years for sterilization laws to become ineffective or overturned. And that in many spaces like Puerto Rico, sterilization laws went well into the late 20th century. Absolutely.
Yeah, and this other point before we get into some of this contemporary politics stuff more, there are the perception that this is science. The perception, okay, most people, although a growing number of people no longer feel this way, but most people understand eugenics bad. You watch Gattaca, you get the point of it. You're rooting for the ungenetically modified guy. Hitler bad, again, increasingly not the case, but still majorities believe Hitler bad. But we still, that being the case, people who understand eugenics bad still might buy into the utility and value of, let's say, an IQ test, and might perceive some of these arguments around IQ and merit as, well, merit is good though, actually. And maybe some populations on the whole can't compete. And these metrics themselves aren't the problem. If I believe that IQ tests are real and good, but also don't think there should be any policy changes behind it, is that a bad thing per se? And I do worry about the need to really clarify that the tests themselves, as you explained in the example of the Ellis Island questionnaire, are designed to get the results that they want, that the designer of the IQ test himself did not want it to be applied beyond the discrete use to decide what children needed additional attention in a school setting because of the inherent failings of that
Precisely.
test itself. And that this extends well beyond IQ tests you mentioned, or maybe I mentioned. I remember this example, I think, from college,
Yeah.
of the fingerprinting. And how fingerprinting, as I recall correctly, please correct me, it's been 20 years, Professor, but fingerprinting was adapted in India precisely because of this combination of British colonists feeling that they couldn't tell Indian people apart, and that they believed Indians had an inherent immorality, that a predisposition to crime and dishonesty and theft.
Precisely. Yes.
And therefore needed to be tracked. And how so many of our tracking technologies it was deemed to be, it was considered to be inappropriate at first to even apply them to white people.
Yes.
Because it was so stigmatizing.
Precisely.
And diminishing.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, you're sort of, we forget that we think of these ideas as really quite absurd nowadays, but they were quite serious in their days. Our entire photographic, I love your nod to the Indian identification system under colonization. And we had very, very parallel moves that were obviously also happening in the US that were tied immediately to the Immigration Exclusion Acts that I was mentioning in the 19th century that eugenicists had effectively argued for. Our passports, the kind of notion of passports as a visual control, all of that the earliest experiments with that, or the earliest applications of that, started with the Chinese, and they were not universally applied. They were applied very specifically to the Chinese initially because there was also this notion, precisely very much in kind of line with colonial anxieties, or with, in this case, nativist anxieties, with a notion of this population as, again, being a kind of more inclined to criminality, of trying to sort of skirt the system, of getting around and under the system, of their wily methods, managing to sort of circumvent either U.S. immigration law or U.S. Labor laws. And so this notion of having to not just have a kind of photographic documentation, so that when someone entered the port, they were forced to be able to demonstrate that they were who they were, right? So again, this sort of attempt for biometric control. At a time, we should keep in mind where it was not obviously being able to have access to some version of photographic self-documentation was not something that was easy to acquire, and again was another form of a version of a filter. At the time, there was also like a kind of an attempt to sort of morally document passengers who were coming in, Chinese women explicitly first, and then also applied to the Chinese population in order, again, to have a kind of moral documentation and valence and metric, where they needed to sort of prove and demonstrate who sponsors were, where they were coming from, who their family was, and essentially being able to sort of attest to good moral standing in written documentation, again, before it was applied at all in any version, in any kind of further version of sort of literacy tests as a means to kind of metricize moral worth.
Yes, and the metricization, the use of what were at the time new technologies, and we're talking about the photograph. I mean, the photography was invented in like 1839, if I remember.
Yeah. Oh.
So I wrote my thesis on not exactly on this.
I love this, Rihanna. This is great.
But I was in the history of science part with Peter Theil and all of them. So
yes,
I wrote about the anatomical atlas and why, despite this push at the time to kind of technological, like make everything seem objective and empirical through the use of new technologies, anatomical atlases seem to resist that trend and were drawn throughout the period. That was the subject of my thesis. But the broader point that I'm trying to make is that the fact of these technologies, including photography, which now we think of more as like art, help to make what had up until that point been value neutral, like kind of not value neutral, like subjective opinions, or fields that were not taken very seriously because of the subjectivity inherent to them, like psychology. People were trying to make it seem more empirical and objective by applying these forms with these technologies, which seem to index the truth. So now, instead of me saying these people are morons or mentally inferior in some way, I can take a bunch of pictures of people in a row and say, these are the features that capture what an idiot looks like. These are the features that capture what a criminal looks like. This is a fingerprint. This is, and it makes it seem like real science in a way that it didn't before, and objective, and not just I'm a racist or whatever. But look, that you can't deny what your eyes are telling you with this photograph, with this scientific instrument is conveying.
Precisely. This is a sort of the kind of I would say tactic of and strategy of eugenicists over and over again, that through some version of datification, they could constantly sort of lean back on the notion that they weren't doing politics. They were just doing something evidentiary. Their work was just research based. The kind of when they blew up the kinds of maps of Madison Grant in the hallways of Congress in the weeks preceding the passage of the 1917 Immigration Exclusion Acts, right, saying that these maps will demonstrate a version of the kind of degeneration that we'll see happen in the U.S. to U.S. populations if we sort of allow ourselves to get flooded by this sort of waves of unfit immigrants, right? All of that was again supposedly based on some version of the effective use of data, again to demonstrate, to supposedly underscore that this was not about them lobbying for power. This is just them essentially showing a kind of map for the future that was research based, that was based in a kind of real indexing of society around us. One other part to your kind of notion of who was getting datafied that you were just describing, Brianna, that I wanted to underscore was that although I mean it's imperative that we remember, and that we kind of build this connection, and that eugenicists allow us to see this connection between the hyper datification and the hyper surveillance that we're seeing, especially of vulnerable populations, underserved populations, minority populations today, and the kind of outsized harm, damage, dispossession, consequence, violence, consequence on life and death that we're seeing happening disproportionately to overly monetized, monitored and surveilled populations today. Again, we see that all start with the eugenicists and eugenic movements from over 100 years ago, with their kind of focus on datification of the unfit, essentially to kind of prove, again, that you could correlate, that there were these correlations between specific populations, the poor, etc., Black and brown populations, immigrant populations, disabled populations, and other forms of more hidden unfitness, low IQ, hidden criminality, criminal tendencies, hidden tendencies that you couldn't see with your own eyes, to alcoholism and underproductivity, and even to future descent, right? This is what their program was. We can give you a program for predicting and designing the future, and to keep yourselves from having to spend unnecessarily good public monies on undeserving populations. This was their promise, right? Right. Exactly. But I want to just underscore very, very quickly that it wasn't just at the in the beginning and at the end as well. I mean, it wasn't just unfit populations who eugenicists argued needed to be datified. They wanted to datify themselves, and this started. I mean, I mentioned Francis Galton, a really interesting case study and portrait. If you want to sort of look and see who the roots, where the roots of tech broism comes from, absolutely a version of just self-endowed, hyper-surveilling inventor of datification technologies who would use secret and invisible counters, handheld counters in his pocket to surveil women in neighborhoods across London, insistent that he would be able to create a real beauty map of London that would correlate, of course, to good neighborhoods with higher propensities to beauty and bad
He's
neighborhoods.
just like Mark Zuckerberg.
Absolutely.
That was the original Facebook, hot or not.
Absolutely. But Galton was also somebody who, again, was very keen on, and again, datifying the kind of and trying to prove the worth of the fit, right? I mean, like his initial experiments of like, let's just sort of datify the kind of who's and prove that there is more worth in the kinds of sons and daughters, so sons really, I mean, when you're looking at the who's of elite families, and that we can prove natural talent, and that talent and genius have higher propensities in these already literary, well-endowed, elite patrician families, right? That was he's essentially sort of giving you insight to his own anxieties around the non-basis, in fact, of his own sort of elite status and privilege. And the kinds of things that he was doing, I mean, all of his experiments, leading up to his eventual, he was endowed with an anthropometric lab at University College London. I mean, again, just to underscore, these were not sort of fringe quack experimenters operating in the shadows of research communities. They were front and center, and ones who were enabled, whose agenda for eugenic reengineering was well enabled by other institutions of power around them. But some of the things that he was doing leading up to the building out of his eugenic or his anthropometric lab at University College London was building out at public exhibits and public fairs in London his own sort of anthropometric lab architecture, where he would essentially apply his new datification technologies to any members of the public who are willing to sort of self-datify and who are interested in getting their own kind of data profile around things like strength of blow, acuity of vision, strength of grip, all of these things that we none of us think of as sort of in any way
Relevant.
correlate, right, exactly, to any version of like he
Yeah.
was convinced that the kind of that there was a correlation between physical fitness, moral fitness, and intelligence, right? Mental fitness, that all of these things could get clustered together. And there
This
were
is again
thousands of
sounding
people.
very, very much like what's going on with the overlap between these tech bros and this like life sustaining. There's the guy who keeps injecting
Absolutely.
his son's
Yes.
blood.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's combined with this kind of what used to be kind of left coded woo woo health
Yes.
and fitness, self maximizing, life maxing
Yeah,
model.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Very, yeah, exactly, exactly. These guys really operate in their kind of closed world bubble. And again, where they're kinds of, there are two parts of it. One where there's sort of image where, of course, they're kind of their notion and entitlement to experimentation knows no bounds, right? So when we see an internet that now is essentially and social media platforms that are essentially built and constructed as the world's largest experimentation platform, these are the largest platforms for experimentation with human publics at scale, with essentially no bars, and where over and over again the leaders of tech companies have refused and lobbied against any version of even light regulation to maintain any version of accountability to their version of experimentation that at any other university, uh, much
What kind
lower
of
bars.
experimentation do you mean? Because I remember some years ago when the Harvard guys that founded OkCupid had done that study on kind of racial preferences on the app, and they released it. And there was some backlash because of the results of the study, but then there was some backlash about them having done it at all. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, I'm glad we have this information. Like, I'm
Absolutely.
happy the study happened. So are you kind of pushing back against the idea that they should be doing these experiments at all? That when obviously there's no one's going to be really hurt by that. But or the idea, when you say there should be regulation, I wonder what you mean by that, because there are a lot of people I think in this audience who are, as much as they might dislike Elon Musk and his politics, they also don't like the extent to which the US government and its own surveillance apparatus has tried to do its own moderation and censorship on these apps that has nothing to do with like the greater public interest. And neither Elon's censorship nor the government's censorship are transparent or trusted. And that they'd rather have maybe laissez-faire than like more untransparent regulation.
I would say that there's a number of different conversations that are happening around thinking around like what kind of model would we actually have a safer if we thought about social media platforms and online communication technologies in the same way that we might think about other forms of sort of public infrastructures, whether it's transportation or medicine. I mean, where there's some sort of baseline for public safety that we could expect, especially when we're talking about the youngest members of our family, the oldest members of our family, the most intimate versions of our lives, really sort of being trafficked across this space, right? That we should at least have some version of baseline safety. Even tech companies themselves, right? I mean, the notion that they would have set up different sorts of safety boards and office and teams, very underfunded and very undersized, but gives you a sense of at least some version of like minimal that there should be, even from their point of view, once upon a time, a kind of minimal expectation for safety. All of those things, of course, are now being eroded. Safety
So
teams. I
by
mean, like,
safety, you mean like end-to-end encryption style safety, or like what you talk about in I think your first chapter, where it's like pointing out how all of the content regulation that does exist is concentrated overwhelmingly in the United States, even though there's like we constitute like 10% of all of Facebook's traffic as compared to like India, which is like a third of all of the traffic or something.
that's right. Yeah. I mean, much of the safety teams, I would say, as they were operating within social media, in the space of social media, were really focused on sort of disinformation in the US. I mean, that was the kind of large framework of like disinformation that would
Which
have
got
any
so
kind of
just got
version
so
of like,
negatively stigmatized. Like, right, this this is part of the problem. Like, I'm compelled by the reality that there is obviously within these tech companies, whatever their politics are, even if they're right coded, still a belief that for their own benefit, there needs to be content moderation so that the apps aren't unusable, so that it's not all porn and go kill yourself.
Right.
So like, but I just want to flag, I have to flag, because I know that people in the audience's ears are going to perk up, that there's this other part of it that was, you know, um, uh, political administrations saying, don't share information about lab leak theory, for instance, which just this past week or two, the CIA finally comes around to saying, yeah, totes my goats, it was lab leak theory. And feeling like that sort of suppression, that kind of moderation, that kind of misinformation monitoring is people are very suspicious of. The word misinformation is like very stigmatized right now as a consequence of that sort of behavior.
Sure, yeah, right. But at the same time, I mean, you can obviously see that there can be real consequences when you, I mean, open up the book to sort of demonstrate that this notion that we don't know what's going to happen when we take out content moderation, we can already see what's happened in any number of different contexts, especially globally, because this experiment, and as I say, these are platforms for experimentation on publics. These are not, and where by this point now, we see some of the consequences of that, and they are not unknowns.
Can
So
you
the
talk about what
notion,
happened in India?
so
Yeah,
precisely in the
sorry.
context of the largest for the largest democracy on the world, in India, we have had a design disinvestment in safety and content moderation, such that on any number of Facebooks, which is one of the kinds of main ways that publics in India are able to access the internet and social media messaging. A kind of rise of disinformation and explosion of disinformation have been coming up since, I mean, by the mid 2010s, varied nonprofits, NGO workers, human rights organizations were sort of calling out what they noticed was a real spike, not just in disinformation that targeted minoritized populations, especially Muslim minoritized populations, Dalit minoritized populations, but that actually translated into some version of mob violence against supposed sightings of things like there is such and such unknown stranger that's coming into the area, and it looks like they are here to do some version of conversion of our Muslim village, steal wives, kidnap children, etc. The victims of this, I mean, you could see even on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times reported some of the kinds of results of this that were happening that were startling to many sort of global readers, English language readers of the liberal press, reading about this sort of escalation of mob violence that was happening in site after site across in province after province across India, but that nonprofit workers, local human rights organizations, local organizers had been calling out for a while, because some of the victims had been everyone as young as 12-year-old boys to Google workers themselves, again, sort of being targeted for being a sort of unknown entity that looks suspicious, and we're suddenly a kind of rapid relay of messaging across social media platforms, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, would suddenly lead to some version of uncontrolled violence. And what could you end up doing? Who could you hold accountable at that point? Even Facebook workers themselves, when they were doing studies on the impacts of their platform around the 2010s, and we saw some of this get leaked out with the Frances Haugen papers, that Facebook workers themselves were aghast and were reporting back up to leadership channels that what the impacts of disinformation were in terms of bloodied violence. UN reports on what we had seen in Myanmar around an escalation, in this case of violence against Rohingya populations, and where again a kind of organization of a majoritarian population, in this case a Buddhist population, against the Rohingya Muslim minority population, operating at scale and orchestrated through national governments who were looking to social media essentially as their right-hand tool, favorite tool to be able to sort of amplify and sort of shore up majoritarian and popular support around fanning the flames of some kind of minoritized threat.
Yeah, I think you made the point that Zuckerberg, even though he was forced after that leak happened to sort of acknowledge, to issue this report and acknowledge that they needed to do better and have more content moderation in other parts of the world and stuff, still advertised, sort of bragged about the fact that winning politicians had the largest Facebook following, as though like
Absolutely.
we are happy to have, the dark side of it is like we are happy to be the tool that enables oftentimes despotic authoritarian ideas to disseminate broadly enough to win political coalitions.
Absolutely. I mean, Zuckerberg was featured shaking hands with Narendra Modi, again, a sort of well-known nationalist, Hindu nationalist political leader, who many human rights organizations have really critiqued for leaning into a kind of minoritarian violence and fanning the flames of minoritarian dispossession, deal making, and very happy. And the heels of all of this reporting, still quite happy to sort of re-secure the kind of prominence of Facebook as essentially the internet in India. And so the kind of alignment of Silicon Valley and sort of people what might have thought that publics, U.S. Reading publics, using user publics, might have assumed was a sort of a nicer, kinder version of the internet tech bro, right? It's not the Google boys or the Mark Zuckerberg or even Jeff Bezos, who's not supposedly like a Peter Thiel, who has been a very staunch kind of anti-democratic institution advocate, for now well documented in almost 20 years, 2 decades of this sort of kind of underscoring of supposedly the incompatibility between Silicon Valley innovation and democratic institutions, or people like Elon Musk, with this sort of now alignment with AfD, right-wing nationalist parties in Germany, and his own kind of strange, weird salute, Nazi-like salute to audiences.
Nazi-like.
Again. Exactly. Yeah.
Nazi-like. I'm sorry. I have a friend who is so smart and who fully knows better. But after like a day or two of conservatives like claiming up and down that it wasn't a Nazi, was like, Brianna, are you sure? Like, do we think that this is a Nazi salute?
Yeah.
And I was like, girl, don't let them gaslight you. You know what you saw. Like, do not let them gaslight you. That was a Nazi salute as clear as there has ever been a Nazi salute.
Exactly.
Don't let them get you, girl.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Brianna. No, I love it. Yeah. Thank you.
Stand firm in that one.
In any case, yeah. So the range of all of that now, right? So the whole kind of alignment that we see with Silicon Valley around the MAGAist agenda and explicitly eugenicist agenda. This isn't a right-wing turn in Silicon Valley. This is very explicitly Silicon Valley knows how it's what the impacts of its disinvestment and de-architecting of safety has been. It will now experiment with that on U.S. publics. We will certainly start to see outcomes after March when the largest social media platforms are going to start pulling, of course, and disinvesting in their own sort of safety boards and teams, and starting to allow, as they claim, a kind of better version of free speech to populate. We know what that will look like, and it is absolutely distant. They've already done that experiment. And
so
when I say that,
I'm sorry. When you say that, I didn't mean to cut you
when
off.
you say that it's an experiment that's happening on publics over and over again, it's precisely that. It's this kind of thinking of A/B testing across. I mean, within companies, it's usually thought of as simply A/B testing. Let's see what will happen if we change or tweak this feature, whether or not it ends up with the notion normally that it's going to be something that let's see how it gets more clicks or what kind of traffic it generates. But of course, the experiments happen on a much more consequential decisions around what kinds of teams that we're going to architect altogether, whether or not it's worthwhile or profitable or not profitable. It's whether it's worth our dollars to expend on safety teams for these particular publics or not. And we know for essentially for the entire existence of Facebook, it has been one where they have not disinvested in where they have not invested in any version of safety for global publics under the notion that it's simply not worth their penny, but also where there's lives essentially, and where they recognize, where it has been underscored over and over again. They have to have recognized already that this is something that actually causes lives and costs lives.
Well, I'm curious what you think we should do about that, because this is one that's been very tricky, I think, for the left. You see something like the TikTok ban that is explicitly pushed by the people that pushed it for the reason of the popularity of the pro-Palestine movement on the app, for instance. You see the limited, admittedly, but successes of movements like Black Lives Matter getting their legs on Twitter through hashtags. You see the way that the mainstream media is shut down to, left of Kamala voices, and the way that the Bernie blackout happened and how dismissive of any left politics the mainstream MSNBC, CNN are in this country. And the TikTok, Instagram, the Twitter, all of these are avenues, YouTube, for independent media to flourish, even despite the fact that we recognize that we are throttled and censored in various ways because the owners of these apps don't favor our interests. Nonetheless, they favor untraditional conservative interests, and therefore we can kind of coast off of the wake of the permissiveness that's set up for them. Mm-hmm. And so when we start to talk about censorship or any kind of safety protocols, I think that there's a legitimate concern from the left that what we're going to get is a recreation of traditional media, which was more hostile to the left than untraditional media has been. And so to find it, I think we struggle to find ourselves, we struggle to put ourselves in this position to be rooting for more censorship by entities that are 100%, whether they're liberal, mainstream conservative, mainstream Democrats, they're going to be mainstream and completely antithetical to our interests. And when you say hold people accountable, hold people responsible for acts of violence, especially out the context of American First Amendment rights, that also becomes scary. Are we going to say that because I said I like what's the shooter guy's name? Sorry, Luigi Mangione, that if the next person that gets killed, I'm rounded up and taken to jail because I said Luigi Mangione was a hero and lit a votive candle with his face on it or something, hypothetically.
Yeah. I mean, I would absolutely be worried about the way that any version of interpretation of either freedom of speech, academic freedoms, et cetera, gets interpreted by this particular administration. Absolutely.
With all the Israel stuff, yeah. And all the universities, but Harvard just had a bad week.
Exactly. No, there is no limit on the number of contradictions that this can yield. And at the end of the day, I mean, Twitter itself as its own sort of space where you've seen, of course, Musk supposedly lean into a version of free speech, but only if it's for accounts that don't criticize him. And where he will black out accounts or deprioritize accounts that have been critical of his own of his funding agenda, of his own management of X, any of that kind of exceptionalism, and that notion that the rules actually don't apply to them. I mean, that you will see any number of times on these platforms. So, and amongst this particular kind of coterie.
This gets to an important point that I really want to make sure we don't miss. Getting back to the kind of Peter Thiel of it all and what the broader project of all of this is. We mentioned the kind of alignment in goals between affluent elites and the desire not to have public spending go to the poor. And so the point of so much of this eugenics style framing as being defining this group of undeserving poor. This other piece that I found to be really interesting is your argument that this kind of that this kind of cohort, this tech-based cohort finds democracy and freedom to be fundamentally incompatible. And this is a quote you have in here from Peter Thiel. An acknowledgement that the success of this technological economy requires an unbridled, unlimited freedom for these innovators who are supposed to be special big brain geniuses that should not be constrained by any sort of regulation. And therefore, their project is fundamentally undemocratic. And they are not shy about saying that it is undemocratic. So they have to come out with these roundabout explanations for why the public, who is fundamentally protected by democracy, that's the whole point, should give up their democratic rights and let these rich billionaire techno autocrats live. And I want to, in case you think I'm being melodramatic, I want to read this quote that you included from Peter Thiel. In an essay for the Cato Institute, he wrote, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." Quiet part out loud. "The future of technology is not predetermined, and we must resist the temptation of technological utopianism, the notion that technology has a momentum or will of its own, that it will guarantee a more free future. A better metaphor is that we are in a deadly race between politics and technology." Politics versus technology. Okay. "The fate of our world may depend on the effort of a single person who builds or propagates the machinery of freedom that makes the world safe for capitalism." The goal, to make the world safe for capitalism, you have to give up your freedom.
Right. Precisely. Yeah. I mean, this is when you hear Elon Musk in the kind of opening day, sort of predicting in the opening days of the Trump administration that the American public will simply have to get used to feeling a little bit more hardship. That is not by any means a kind of, I mean, that is really his prediction and his kind of warning to the American public that this sort of range of policies that I would love for Doge to be able to actually execute is going to not feel comfortable. And not just not comfortable, but it's going to be something that may actually, as we saw in the kind of non-accidental kind of canceling of federal funding to any number of different sort of programs that could be thought of as one a kind of whole scale pause, but especially ones that impacted minoritized populations and vulnerable, including Medicare and Medicaid, right? Like kind of wholesale, even popular programs are on the block. So that is Musk really kind of again saying that this is going to require a kind of whole scale revolution on the kinds of programs in our version of what we might have thought of as given and comfortable. The notion too, I mean, so that is a kind of experiment in messaging to sort of see whether or not like what people's appetites for this thing will be. Because at the end of the day, that notion that Thiel is underscoring that he believes that democracy and capitalism are no longer compatible. I mean, that is essentially that is not anything at all. He published this with the Cato Institute back in 2009. He's been speaking publicly, essentially around this line. His funding of any number of MAGA candidates, from Peter Thiel to a whole range of obviously state-based local elections. I'm sorry, JD Vance. Thank you for the correction. To any number of local state-based elections. All of this has been part of a kind of worldview and an ideology that has driven his investments, again, not just in politics, but not just in technology, but in politics. Technology is very much a space where his own investments, I mean, again, Peter Thiel is PayPal, Palantir, the investments in Facebook. I mean, it is a kind of investor engine in and sets a kind of cultural and economic tone for other companies and startups that it is funding. He's a very, very powerful influencer in the kinds of leadership corridors of Silicon Valley. But this notion again that democracy and capitalism are not compatible for him is is quite serious.
Yeah, and I want to draw, like, I want to highlight it and draw like 15 circles around it, because I really want to be clear what this is about. I'm speaking to the audience, not to you. Like, but I think on the like the left, of which I am a part, we have been engaged in a project for years of, in some ways, anticipating the backlash that is currently happening against traditional liberalism, racial inclusion, all of that stuff. by trying, and this has been my project and how I got into journalism, by trying to be clear about what we're saying. You know, I wrote early articles about the weaponization of identity politics against left candidates like Bernie Sanders, saying you can't just blindly say we're going to vote for any Black candidate or any woman candidate. You got to look at the policies. You can't be racially essentialist. Saying, okay, I understand that we're uncomfortable with cultural appropriation, but is our political project being mad at Kim Kardashian for wearing cornrows? Or is it for the fact that, you know, historically marginalized populations don't have as easy access to funding, so they can't open a taco truck in the same way a white person can open a taco truck, and that seems fundamentally unfair? Like, where should our focus actually be? Like, I get the anger at the white people taco truck, but is it really at the white people, or is it about these institutional factors? And that didn't work. Nobody listened to us. They crushed Bernie. And now we're in this world where predictably you have Donald Trump back for a second term. And I think that some people on the left are scrambling for relevance to continue to say, I don't care. We're not going to talk about racism. We're not going to talk about criminal justice issues. We're going to focus on economic issues, and we're going to win back the white working class. And that's what it's going to be. And I do believe in focusing on economic issues and winning back the white working class. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. But I think it's important to talk about this stuff because race is a huge part of the right-wing project, and failing to address it head on and rolling your eyes at everything that's like racially implicated as like quote unquote identity politics is ceding unnecessary ground. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.